Morning. Beautiful Easter Sunday on Maui. We can't talk about the weather here because it's always the same. It's always perfect. But this is always true, too, about the lives of people who have dedicated themselves to the spiritual path. It seems strange to say, how do you feel today, or how are you, or how are things going with you, because you always feel the same and they're always going the same way. That doesn't mean that there aren't problems here and there that come up, but they are not major factors, and there's something that we understand and realize that we must live with as the tares and the wheat until the season of bringing in the harvest, when the tares drop away and the wheat is left. A spiritual community, such as the Master and his disciples, or the disciples and their followers after the crucifixion, or the Quakers in the early days of the United States, or the Christian Scientists in the early days of that movement when they were a small community. All such spiritual communities have this in common, that problems are not vital or life and death. They are merely those things which arise in every human experience and must be met. But the life of the community is close to that of an ideal life, not only among themselves, but as examples to the rest of the cities and states or communities of which they may be a part. For instance, we learn, as we go back into American history, that the Quakers were the only people who had no trouble with the Indians. They were never raided by them. They were never killed. They were never robbed. But neither is there a history of their having done any of those things to the Indians. Then you have to ask yourself, why? Why can one small group of people, be so set apart by the community, or in a community, as to be favored even by what we lightly call savages? And of course the answer is that they had done unto them just as they had done unto the Indians. That conduct which they offered to the Indians was the conduct that was given back unto them, and they were a community completely set apart and known for their good works. In the same way, a couple of centuries later in New England, there were quite a few Quaker settlements. And those settlements were ideal communities. In them there was no poverty. In them was a minimum of disease. And of course there was negligible amount of sin. It was the most rare occasion for a Quaker to be in any kind of difficulty with his neighbors because of erroneous conduct. In the 1930s, a survey was made of the prison population in the United States, and you would be surprised to know that the percentage of Christian Scientists in prison was so small that they couldn't even be numbered in a fraction. In other words, they had to just use the goose egg to describe how many were there. None. Nor alcoholics, nor drug addicts. In the spiritual communities, oh yes, in the 1930s also, at the beginning of the Depression, every Christian Science church did what all others did. They started relief funds and collected food and clothing and money to use for their members who had been hit by the Depression. But do you know that within 6 months these all had to be disbanded? And from then on there was no relief work in the Christian Science churches because there was nobody needing relief. And among the Quakers and among the Mormons and among the followers of Father Divine, all of these people went through the Depression without being on relief, without poverty, without suffering. These are the spiritual communities that have existed in these modern times. Now, I'm not speaking of those people who come to the study of the spiritual teachings because they, like we who have gone before them, come with all of the problems of mankind, both of sin, disease, lack, limitation, unhappiness, and so forth and so on. We have long histories of error in our experience. But after a period of years of serious study, meditation, devoting oneself to the spiritual life, these problems begin to fade. And we, of the Infinite Way, should begin to be a community showing forth the fruitage of our spiritual living. We also should be approaching that stage of our development when poverty disappears from our midst, and those who come into our circles in poverty soon learn how spiritually to rise above it. We should be showing forth a community virtually sinless, certainly of any major form of or serious form of sin, because we have at this point discovered how unnecessary the sins of the world are. Lying, cheating, misrepresenting, injustice, intolerance. Haven't we seen through all of those? Do we not recognize the stupidity of indulging them? then we should be a community so completely free that by our example, the rest of the entire community can say they must have something. And of course what we have is not a virtue of our own. Above all things we have learned that. We can't afford to be self-righteous and say that we are better than they. It is only that we have learned that the grace of God takes over our experience, and the grace of God maintains a spiritual community in prosperity, in justice, in health, in harmony, in helping each other. Oh, it will inevitably be that regardless of times or circumstances, some among us will fall into sickness temporarily, or sin, or lack, or some other unfortuitous circumstance. But then the rest of the spiritual community is there not only with spiritual help and forgiveness of the 70 times 7, but also with whatever is necessary of those human aids that sometimes temporarily are needful. The only question on this desk this morning is, please give us light on lead us not into temptation. Well, of course, all of human experience is a temptation. There is the temptation to prosper when the rest of the country is having a boom, and there is the temptation to lose when the rest of the country is having a depression. There is the temptation to fall into sickness when epidemics and so forth are traveling around the world. There is the temptation under certain circumstances to lie or cheat a little or falsely advertise or so forth. Human experience is completely made up of temptation, and no one ever rises so high in the spirit as to rise above temptation. No one can rise that high. That was the meaning of Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Can you not remain awake with me 1 hour? The disciples were under such temptation to fall asleep in their ministry, and Jesus was under the temptation, evidently, of fearing that the presence and power of God may not sustain him in that fatal hour. And so with that temptation facing him, he wanted the 2 or more to gather together in my name, so that the Christ may be made evident. Undoubtedly, it was only a momentary thing with him, but the temptation was there. He met it. Peter was tempted. He not only was tempted, he fell very hard for the temptation to deny the Master. The one that he had traveled with for 3 years, from whom he had learned, the one who had lifted him into such high consciousness that he could see through humanhood and discern the Christ. Nevertheless, when his own life and freedom were endangered, he fell into the temptation of being human. You see, self-preservation is the first law of human nature. And naturally, our first attempt as humans would be to save our own lives. Doesn't make any difference who else gets trapped in the fire or the flood. Doesn't make any difference who goes down with the sinking ship. We are always standing there as humans, ready to save our own lives. But as one rises in spiritual nature, one's human life becomes of less importance, because it becomes evident that we do not die with the grave. And so it is comparatively unimportant whether we remain here on earth or whether we continue our life on another plane. We have come to the conviction that I was never born and therefore I will never die. Life is eternal. With that understanding, it is much, much better to save the life of a person, more especially one whose conviction is that this is the life that's important. Help them at their level of consciousness. The same as the beggar who comes to your door, you can't say a prayer for him and at the same time refuse him a meal. Because at that moment, the meal is of more importance than the prayer. The meal is a means of self-preservation. So it is. There is never a moment when we are not being tempted. We are tempted to believe that sin, disease, and death are realities, and to pity those who go through those experiences, instead of withholding pity and giving spiritual understanding. We are continuously being tempted to preserve our own life or our own money or our own fortunes or our own properties, none of which is wrong unless it's at the expense of someone else. But those temptations do come. Members of a spiritual community learn to meet these temptations, and if temptation gets too strong for one, that one learns to confide in someone else on that same path of that same community and ask for help. Just the same as if one of us were sick, we would confide it to another one on this path and say, give me help. We would not think it wrong at all. But then, when the temptation of family unhappiness comes to us, or family misunderstandings, or community misunderstandings, we hesitate because we fail to realize that this too is a temptation. And if we are not meeting it with our own understanding, do the same as we would with a physical disease. Let us seek out one of our own community, one in whose integrity and understanding we have faith. Let them give us help. And so it is that we learn first that our experience is an individual one. We ourselves must devote the hours to study, to meditation, to self-improvement. And even though we meet with others, the demonstration is still an individual one. It is we who are lifting ourselves, even though we may get some help by meeting with others. We ourselves have to work with ourselves and within ourselves in order to bring ourselves to the point of ability to meditate, to contact our center, to overcome the major temptations of our human experience, whatever they may be. This is an individual thing. But just remember that if each one of us is individually working with ourselves to this end, that in a very short time we are a community of people who have attained some measure. Although each one may have attained it for himself, we are now a community of those who have attained. By helping and continuing to help those of our community, our spiritual community, who fall into temptation physically, mentally, morally, financially, we continue to unfold and to develop and to deepen and to ripen until we too bear fruit richly. Now, looking at ourselves, we now find not a student spiritually developed, but a community spiritually developed. And then we find that the nature of our individual prayer and meditation work helps to lift the entire community, so that in time of infection or contagion, that our individual work lifts our entire community. Not that the responsibility is on the shoulder of one person to do it for all, although it sometimes works out that way, that a few dedicated souls do make the whole demonstration for the whole community, but it should not be so. Every individual should so develop themselves that all working together keeps the entire community free from infection, from contagion, from accident, from poverty, from lack, from limitation. And ultimately you find, or should find, and must find, that same experience, that if there are savages on the island, they will not eat you. Because, first of all, you have borne no ill will to them, and you have reaped in kind. In the same way that if sin or disease races across the island, it shall not come nigh thy dwelling place, the dwelling place of this spiritual community. And so it is that times of depression come, or inflation, or whatever name it may have when it comes. And then too it should be said, temporarily, the first few months, some of us get hit and have to make adjustments, but then our united consciousness of God's presence soon lifts up those who have fallen by the wayside. And lo and behold, they are in other employment or self-employment or one or another ways have come to freedom from the temptation of that particular era. Jesus Christ is called the way shower because he showed us the way to live. He showed us the way to live and the way to die, and the way to rise up again. The disciples, in some measure, exemplified that living and that dying. In a measure, they exemplified a community of spiritual people. They had their problems, many of them. James, known as the brother of Jesus, never did become reconciled to the ways of the other disciples, and always held himself aloof and in complete disagreement with almost everything the disciples did. Mainly because James was the brother of a Hebrew rabbi, and he looked with disapproval on teaching this wonderful message to the Gentiles, who weren't, of course, good enough for this message. Only we Hebrews were good enough for it. And so James never did come into an agreement that there should be missionary work. In the same way, for a while, Peter was bitten by that same bug. And he didn't approve of going out to the Gentiles until he had that vision. That vision in which the pig was lowered in a sheet, and he was told to kill it and eat it. And of course, Peter was a good Jew. He wouldn't eat pig meat. And he called it filthy. But 3 times he was offered that food. Each time he refused, until the voice spoke to him and said, call nothing filthy that God hath made. And through that he learned his lesson, and when a few days later the Gentile, the centurion, Cornelius, sent for him and asked for instruction in this wonderful new faith, Peter had learned to call no man filthy whom God hath made, and he went out and shared with Cornelius, and he was in such a high spirit that the Holy Ghost descended upon all of that band who was gathered there to learn of him. Now, you know, Paul was the one who was the most ardent in wanting to go out into the world, into Greece, into Rome, and to teach this to the pagans and the Gentiles and the non-Christians and so forth. And you know that they put him on trial for it. So you see, they had their problems. Oh yes, right after the crucifixion, they formed a communist society in which everyone agreed to contribute everything that they had to one common fund, and then they would all live from it, because they knew that the authorities wouldn't let them live, wouldn't let them work, wouldn't let them earn. And so they were forced into a communist society into which those that did not have would share with those who had too much. But you know that failed also, as all such communities must fail. Why? Well, if all of the wealthy people of this island distributed all they had to everybody else on this island, it would only be a few years until the same ones and their families would have it back again. Because you can't give anyone anything that their consciousness doesn't earn. And so they won't be able to hold on to it. Therefore, dividing up the wealth isn't the answer. But there is an answer. And that answer we learn in our spiritual community. Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have give I unto thee. What do I have? My contact with God. My spiritual realization of my oneness with God. The realized Christ I have. And if I give that or share that with you, you are lifted up out of your physical, mental, moral, and financial poverty. And in every one of those departments, you become free and independent, without anyone's charity, without anyone's giving. Do you see that? That is the benefit of a spiritual community. Of course, if one falls into lack or limitation, we will share from our pocketbook. But that is the least of what we have to give. Certainly if someone's homeless, there's no reason we shouldn't let them put their tent on our lawn, temporarily, not permanently. That would defeat our spiritual purpose. For our spiritual purpose is always to say, silver and gold have I none, but such as I have give I unto thee. And that is the Christ, the Spirit of the living God. And with that, you will soon find your rightful place, whether it's a home, an activity, employment, profession, art, whatever it may be. In a spiritual community, none of the evils of this world can remain, at least in any depth or degree. Minor, yes. At all times there will be some here and some there requiring some help. But the community as a whole will show forth better health, better sense of supply, better sense of harmonious and happy human relationships, a better sense of joy, a greater sense of peace, safety, and security than any other community in the world. Why? Because we are enveloped in that consciousness, in which we learn that if you live and move and have your being, none of these evils will come nigh thy dwelling place. At first we learn to demonstrate this individually for ourselves. Then gradually we find that we can extend to a member of our family, a receptive member, some measure of this benefit, and then gradually to others, and finally to communities. Not that we will embrace everyone who lives on this island, but that into this community will flow those receptive and responsive to the spiritual message, and then even others, by witnessing this group activity, if you want to call it that, this community of spiritual living people, will in some measure lift themselves up and be that much better merely by recognizing what is going on in the midst of you. Of course, individual responsibility is such that each one of us must discipline ourselves to know that we want nothing of each other but the spiritual help and the spiritual word, and that whatever we share out of our heart, not out of duty, out of our heart. And whatever we receive from others, we receive knowing that it's a outflowing of their heart, not duty, not obligation. We spiritually have to learn, and we first learn it individually, that all that the Father hath is mine, and therefore I need look no other place. Then just remember, when we have an entire community living in that consciousness, just see then how free the flow is. And not because anyone needs it, and not because it's anyone's duty to do it, but because the Spirit of the Lord God is the love that flows through us. At this stage of our unfoldment, we must show, not exhibit to the world, but show forth in our own demonstration, that we need not use the weapons of this world. Now remember, they have only the arm of flesh, that is, temporal weapons. And when Hezekiah said that, he meant that temporal weapons are not power. For we have the Lord God Almighty. And as we are taught in the Bhagavad Gita, sword cannot pierce the spirit which I am. Flames cannot burn the spirit which I am. Nothing external to me can quench the life that I am. I am life eternal, and nothing from without a man can enter to defile or make a lie. I and my Father are one. And I have only the qualities of God, the essence of God, the nature of God, and this cannot be pierced by a knife. It cannot be starved by a lack of food. It cannot be drowned by waters. Not the life that I am. Once you perceive this, that your life is immortal and eternal, you are no longer a human being in the sense that self-preservation means anything to you. Self-preservation is meaningless now because there is no self to preserve. The I that I am is self-created, self-maintained, self-sustained, because it is one with its source, which is God. As we abide in this, you see that we do not present human appearances anymore. We do not take advantage of the weapons of the world. We do not have to defend ourselves with armies or with guns. Yes, when we fall into the temptation of the world again, then you go back to the ways of the world. I'm thinking now of one of the very great spiritual lights of all time. His name was Nanak, and he founded one of the great religions of the world. And the Sikhs. And when he founded it, he said to his disciples and his followers, the same as I say to ours, don't organize, don't build temples and costly palaces. Don't do this. You lose your spirituality. And once he said to them, don't accumulate collective wealth, because you'll need armies to defend it. Don't build great temples, because you'll need armies to protect them. And they were at that time like the Quakers, the gentle people of India. But his son succeeded him, and then his son succeeded him. And that's when the trouble began with the grandson, because he decided that his father and his grandfather were so great that nothing was too good for their memory. And so he built that which even to this day is the greatest temple in all of India, and the most valuable and the most expensive and the one most ornately designed and trimmed and most bejeweled, Amritsar. Naturally, people began raiding it. You need a little diamond here, a little pearl here, a little ruby here. And so you had to have an army. And of course today the Sikhs are the war tribes of India. They are the war race. Just think, out of a gentle beginning of a man who knew enough to know that if you build such wealth, you'll have to have an army to defend it. So it is. If we realize that our wealth is the manifestation of divine consciousness, we would have to build armies to protect it, even if it mounts up into millions. But the danger is that when there is collective wealth, such as a religious organization, you no longer have the spiritual integrity to hold it, and then you've got to have legal laws and armies and attorneys and whatnot to hold on and to multiply it and add to it. Then also comes the pride. Well, when I was a director, we doubled the wealth of our church. You only got half as much. Then the next one comes and wants to double that. Now, a spiritual community has no need of collective wealth, that is, a central fund, beyond any of the immediate needs. Why? Well, as an illustration, I am providing that should I leave this plane, the activities which still must be carried on, such as the editing of my books and so forth, will be financially cared for. And beyond that, there is no financial arrangement for carrying on anything of the infinite way. Why? Because every individual who becomes a part of the infinite way must demonstrate through their own consciousness for themselves, and if there is a collective group, for that collective group, but not beyond. Do you see that? This is a teaching in which a spiritual community develops individual spiritual consciousness as well as the collective that provides for the day thereof. We go back to the Hebrews again. Do not lay up treasure where moth and rust doth corrupt, or where you have to provide so that somebody else doesn't have to develop their state of consciousness. No, our spiritual community will be made up of people who have demonstrated the consciousness of the presence of God, and out of that draws all of the wealth necessary for their immediate needs, and teaches all future generations, one generation at a time, to go and do likewise or disappear off the face of the earth, whichever you'd like. So, our spiritual community should need no watchmen. We should need no directors to make a book of rules or laws, for each one should be governed by the Spirit of God, and wherever anyone fails, there should be others of sufficient spiritual awareness to correct them and help them back on the path. Without a book of rules, without excommunication, as you travel across the 48 states that are on the continent, you can't help drawing comparisons with Europe, where every couple of 100 miles you come to a new border with new guards and new customs men and new collectors and new armies. And you see that a nation 3,000 miles wide and 1,500 miles long, or 3,000 miles long and 1,500 miles wide, can live without borders, without policemen at borders, and without customs men at borders. And then, as you travel Canada, you find that two nations can live together without soldiers at the borders. Well, surely it cannot take much imagination to say, well, then so could all of Europe do that. If only there was the same degree of enlightenment over there on these points that there is here. They may paint better pictures and they may do a little better sculpturing, and they may have a little lead on us on art, but they're far behind us in human relationships. Otherwise their borders would disappear, as eventually all borders will disappear from off the face of the globe. That doesn't mean we won't each be a community. Each state will be a full and complete sovereignty. They may each have their own flag, their own flower, and their own song, and their own name. Yet they will be a complete part of a whole. So it's eventually going to be with the world. Each nation will have a flag and a song and a flower and a name. But there will be one flag that will be raised above each one of these separate flags. And that flag will undoubtedly be the flag of whatever name the United Nations may have at that time, or whatever form it assumes, a confederation of nations. Each will be independent, yet each will be interdependent. So, a spiritual community has to set that example. Each one of us must be individual and independent, and yet each one of us must form the whole brotherhood. The secret, the big secret, lies in this. Silver and gold have I none, such as I have give I unto thee. In other words, I can, by rising high in consciousness, bestow some of the fruitage of my developed consciousness upon you. Each one of you, by developing your spiritual consciousness, in turn include 1, 2, 3, or 10 more in your consciousness, and you bestow upon them some of your consciousness. If you rise high enough, you take this whole group into your consciousness, and each one benefits physically, mentally, morally, and financially by virtue of your consciousness without you doing a human thing. And yet on the human plane, always doing the right human thing. So it will be. Our spiritual community will be a community of individuals, each of whom take upon themselves the responsibility of developing their own spiritual consciousness, and then saying to everybody else in the group, silently and secretly, silver and gold I'm not giving you, but such as I have every day I'm sharing with you. That's my prayers, my realization, my dedication to the Christ. I take you into my prayers, I take you into my spirit. We are of one spiritual household. Naturally, we have learned to say the word I, haven't we? We've learned to close our eyes and say the word I. When we do that, we know that I am neither Jew nor Gentile. I am neither white nor black. I am neither Occidental nor Oriental. I am neither rich nor poor. I am just I in there. And I'm that same I in there when I have no funds or when I have much funds. I am that same I in there whether I'm sick or whether I'm well. Now, in the degree of my realization then, that I within me is God, do you not see how every individual in our whole community must be blessed? How it breaks down the barriers of race, religion, creed, sect, denomination, the upper 10 or the lower 5, as they used to be called in England. Do you not see this? That only in your realization of I can you realize that I am thou. I am in thee, and thou art in me, and we are in God. One, indivisible. One, indivisible. One being, one life, one soul, one spirit, one consciousness. And as we realize that, each of the others partakes in some measure, some degree of our realization and goes out of our presence blessed. Even if they haven't been in our physical presence, they have been spiritually in our consciousness. By virtue of our spiritual development, then, let us take upon ourselves the responsibility of showing forth to the world that we are a spiritual community and that we harbor no hate, no animosity, no jealousies, individually or collectively, among ourselves or out into the world, that we each day set everyone free in Christ, and realizing that we stand alone in Christ, and I can do all things through Christ. In this way, not only individually but as a community, our light is shining forth into the world, and others desire to go and do likewise, or to come and be a part of it. We are not necessarily asking anyone to join us. We have no barriers keeping anyone out. We let our light shine so that those who are attracted may come in. nor are we trying to inflict upon the world a different set of standards than it has made for itself. We are living unto ourselves, letting our light shine, and those that wish to incorporate in their living what we have may do so. We don't even ask them to name themselves infinite way. They can remain whatever they are. For we are not interested in building numbers any more than we're interested in building temples or dollars. Our interest is in showing forth the fruitage of spiritual living, letting the world receive whatever benefit from that it can. One word of caution I have. Still, at this time, we are too apt to do things, to start our day or end our evenings, or engage in business activities or social activities without first turning within for a realization of the present. And this is a mistake and is responsible for many of the problems that we have. We would have far less problems if we agreed with ourselves that we would not leave home in the morning until we have had our click, until we've had our meditation and our realization. We say, oh, we do that. Yes, but then we start something else at 10 o'clock. And we have to forget that this too should be preceded by the realization of the present. I live, yet not I. Christ liveth my life. Or the Christ goes before me, the presence goes before me to make the crooked places straight. We forget at mealtime that we are only eating food unless we have waited for that blink of an eye to recognize that Christ has set this table. God has set this table. Even in a wilderness, God can set a table. And if we eat that way, it can well be that it's just because we can afford it. And we're making no provision, not only for ourselves, but for all the rest of the world, that hasn't yet learned that you do not eat by virtue of having money. You do not eat by virtue of having a garden. You eat by the grace of God. We shop, we market, and very thoughtlessly we just take out money to pay for it or charge it, as if it were our money, as if by our own self we were able to do this thing. And we not only lay up possible trouble for ourselves, but certainly we are not lifting the world, because it is the world that completely believes that they are able to have food and clothing and housing by virtue of its money. But we have learned better. We have these things by the grace of God. Even the money that we think we have by the grace of God. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. But it won't do you any good to say that once a year or think of it once a year. It must be a daily remembrance. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and by the grace of God, I do this or that or the other thing. All of this, you see, constitutes the spiritual community. The group that is not living by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. A spiritual community is one that is not living by its affluence, but by the grace of God. A spiritual community is not one that is living in good health because it's a healthy climate, but living in good health because it's the grace of God. A spiritual community, when it reaches 50 and 60 and 70, doesn't start dreading the grave or old age or decrepitude, because it realizes the harmony of my being is not because of my years or lack of them. The harmony of my being is by virtue of the grace of God. And I live by the grace of God and under the grace of God. I live and move and have my being because the grace of God has made it so. And living in this atmosphere is dwelling in the secret place of the Most High. It is abiding in the Word and letting the Word abide in you, and you must bear fruit richly. And then you are a spiritual community showing forth spiritual fruitage to those who will see. Why then must you keep it so sacred and so secret? Because the very good that you show forth arouses in the unillumined human mind antagonism, envy, jealousy, and hate. That was why Jesus and his community were hated. That is why the disciples and their communities were hated and persecuted. They showed forth too much good. And never forget this. As Jesus said, they persecuted me before they persecuted you, and so I will say to you, they'll persecute you in your time, unless you too are wise. Don't boast, don't brag, don't show forth self-righteousness. Keep everything sacred by keeping it secret and letting it be shouted from the housetops, and then sharing it, not by throwing your pearls before swine, but by keeping it locked up within yourself until you meet those receptive and responsive, and then share with them. Thank you, huh?